A tanker approached the enforcement corridor in the Strait of Hormuz and altered its course without prior communication. The vessel, identified as Rich Starry, increased speed and proceeded toward a restricted zone monitored by U.S. naval forces. The movement was detected immediately. Naval systems tracking the corridor registered the deviation, and response protocols were activated. The incident did not involve cargo inspection or destination verification. Its significance derived from the origin of the vessel and the context in which it operated. The tanker's approach tested an active enforcement structure established by the United States Navy following the imposition of maritime restrictions in the region. Within a short interval, the vessel reversed course and exited the corridor. The sequence did not escalate into confrontation. No direct engagement occurred. However, the outcome carried implications beyond the movement of a single ship. The response demonstrated the operational reach of U.S. naval forces and the conditions governing transit through the strait at that time. The event also reflected the interaction between declared policy and observable capability. The broader context involves a long-standing economic and strategic relationship between China and Iran. Over the past decade and a half, the two countries developed interconnected systems of trade, infrastructure, and energy exchange. China became the primary purchaser of Iranian oil, while Iran provided geographic and logistical access supporting regional connectivity projects. Infrastructure development formed a central component of this relationship. Investment initiatives linked to the Belt and Road Framework extended into Iranian territory, including port access and transit routes intended to diversify supply chains. These projects were designed to reduce reliance on traditional maritime corridors influenced by Western control. In parallel, energy trade continued under conditions shaped by international sanctions. Iranian crude was transported through a network of vessels operating outside conventional regulatory frameworks. This system enabled continued exports despite restrictions and maintained a flow of resources necessary for Iran's economy. The operational environment changed when U.S. naval forces implemented a coordinated restriction of maritime access points. Key export facilities, including Karg Island, were effectively isolated. Additional ports supporting transit and logistics, such as Chabahar and Bandar Abbas, were also affected. These measures disrupted established trade routes and limited the movement of oil shipments. The immediate consequence was the suspension of a significant portion of Iran's export capacity. Oil cargoes, already loaded, remained at sea without access to destination ports. Infrastructure investments connected to these routes became temporarily non-functional. The existing framework linking Chinese demand and Iranian supply was interrupted. The response capability supporting these measures involved a substantial naval presence. Carrier strike groups, surface combatants, and continuous air patrols established control over the operational area. Surveillance assets monitored vessel movement, and enforcement procedures governed access to the corridor. Within this environment, the movement of the Rich Starry represented a direct test of the system. The vessel's approach did not result in escalation, but the subsequent course reversal indicated compliance with enforcement conditions. Additional vessels linked to similar networks exhibited comparable behavior, altering course before entering restricted areas. Official statements issued in response emphasized principles of navigation and existing agreements. These statements were disseminated through formal channels and public communications. However, the operational outcome remained unchanged. No escorted transit occurred, and no vessel proceeded through the corridor under challenge. The divergence between stated position and observable activity became a central feature of the situation. Declarations of access did not translate into movement through the restricted zone. This contrast was visible to multiple stakeholders, including governments, naval forces, and commercial operators monitoring the region. Energy considerations form a critical component of the broader situation. China's import requirements exceed 10 million barrels of oil per day, with a substantial portion transported by sea. A significant share of this supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, linking multiple exporting countries to Asian markets. The restriction of this corridor introduces direct implications for supply continuity. While alternative sources exist, adjustments require time and incur additional cost. Strategic reserves provide temporary mitigation, but sustained disruption affects both pricing and availability. The significance of the tanker's reversal extends beyond immediate logistics. It reflects the constraints imposed by control of a critical maritime route. Access to the strait is determined not only by declared rights, but by the capacity to operate within the conditions enforced in that space. The incident illustrates the interaction between naval presence, economic dependency, and strategic positioning. Movement through the corridor is governed by operational realities that override formal statements. Compliance, in this case, occurred without direct engagement, indicating the effectiveness of enforcement without escalation. The situation continues to evolve within these parameters. Naval forces maintain monitoring and enforcement activities, while affected parties assess available options. The balance between stated intent and demonstrated capability remains a defining element of the current environment. China's position following the disruption of Iranian oil flows is defined by a set of constrained choices shaped by geography, capability, and risk. The loss of Iranian supply alone does not create an immediate energy crisis. China maintains strategic petroleum reserves, estimated to cover several months of consumption, and alternative suppliers remain available. However, the structural issue extends beyond a single source of crude. A substantial portion of China's total imported oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. This includes shipments not only from Iran but from other major producers in the Gulf region. The concentration of supply through a single maritime choke point introduces vulnerability. Control of that choke point by a foreign naval power places a significant portion of China's energy security within external influence. This condition presents a strategic challenge. China's economic model relies on consistent access to large volumes of energy at predictable cost. Disruption to supply routes introduces volatility that affects industrial output, transportation, and broader economic stability. The issue is not limited to immediate shortages but extends to long-term planning and risk management. One potential response involves direct naval intervention to challenge the enforcement structure. In theoretical terms, the People's Liberation Army Navy has expanded its operational reach through overseas infrastructure and a growing fleet. Facilities in the Indian Ocean region provide logistical support for extended deployments. However, the operational environment in the Strait of Hormuz differs from other regions where China has demonstrated presence. The naval forces currently positioned in the area include multiple U.S. carrier strike groups supported by surface combatants, submarines, and continuous air operations. This concentration of capability creates a high-risk environment for any attempt to force passage through the corridor. Direct confrontation would involve engagement between major military powers, with escalation risks extending beyond the immediate theater. Historical comparisons highlight the significance of such a scenario. Instances in which opposing naval forces approached blockade lines have carried the potential for rapid escalation. The presence of advanced weapons systems and the scale of deployed forces increase the complexity of any direct challenge. An alternative approach involves the use of non-military or limited force assets to test enforcement boundaries. This method, often described as operating below the threshold of open conflict, has been applied in other maritime disputes. It relies on maintaining presence without triggering direct engagement. However, the effectiveness of this approach depends on the relative balance of forces and the rules governing enforcement. In the current context, the scale and readiness of U.S. forces reduce the viability of such tactics. Attempts to move escorted commercial vessels through the corridor would likely result in interception or redirection. The outcome would be observable and would reinforce existing enforcement conditions rather than alter them. Diplomatic and economic measures represent another set of options. China holds influence within international institutions and can engage in negotiations aimed at modifying the situation. Economic tools, including trade adjustments and supply chain leverage, provide additional means of response. However, these mechanisms operate over extended timeframes and do not directly resolve the immediate constraint on maritime transit. The operational requirement remains unchanged. Oil must be transported through physical routes that are currently subject to control. Diplomatic processes may influence future conditions, but they do not alter the present configuration of forces or access. A further option involves strategic delay. By adjusting export policies, reallocating resources, and managing consumption, China can absorb short-term disruptions while evaluating developments. This approach reduces immediate risk, but does not eliminate underlying dependency on the strait. Longer-term strategies focus on developing alternative routes that bypass the choke point. Infrastructure projects, extending through neighboring regions, aim to create overland pathways for energy transport. While these initiatives may reduce reliance over time, their current capacity does not match the volume handled by maritime routes. Implementation requires sustained investment and extended development periods. On the opposing side, the United States maintains a significant concentration of naval assets in the region. Carrier strike groups operate in coordination with surface vessels and aerial support, establishing continuous coverage of the operational area. This deployment represents a substantial allocation of military resources. Sustaining such a presence involves logistical considerations, maintenance cycles, personnel rotation, and supply requirements place ongoing demands on supporting systems. Extended deployment in a single region limits flexibility to respond to other global contingencies. International support for the enforcement measures varies. Some allied states have expressed alignment, while others have adopted independent or limited roles. This distribution of participation affects both operational capacity and the perception of legitimacy. The enforcement structure itself is not absolute. Monitoring data indicates that some vessels linked to restricted networks have transited the strait under specific conditions. These instances reflect selective enforcement decisions influenced by operational and political factors. The existence of such cases introduces variability into the system. The interaction between enforcement capability and operational limits creates a dynamic environment. While control of the corridor is established, it is not uniform in every instance. This allows for continued testing of boundaries by affected parties. China's response reflects an assessment of these conditions. Direct confrontation presents high risk, while indirect methods offer limited immediate effect. Diplomatic efforts require time, and alternative infrastructure remains incomplete. The resulting strategy emphasizes caution, observation, and incremental adjustment. The situation remains defined by the relationship between capability and constraint. Movement through the strait depends on compliance with enforced conditions. Efforts to alter those conditions are ongoing, but have not yet produced a change in operational reality. If this breakdown was useful, you can leave your perspective in the comments. Iran's position within the current situation has shifted significantly as a result of the restrictions imposed on its maritime activity. Prior to these developments, control over the Strait of Hormuz functioned as a central element of its strategic posture. The ability to disrupt or restrict passage through the strait provided leverage in both military and economic contexts. The recent sequence of events has altered that balance. Instead of controlling access to the strait, Iran's own export capacity has been constrained by external enforcement. Oil shipments originating from Iranian ports are unable to proceed through established routes, while transit for other actors continues under monitored conditions. This reversal has reduced the effectiveness of a strategy that relied on the threat of disruption. Military capabilities that previously supported this posture have also been affected. Key installations and logistical nodes have experienced degradation, limiting operational flexibility. The capacity to deploy naval assets for further mine-laying or interdiction is constrained by continuous surveillance and the presence of opposing forces in the region. Attempts to reintroduce disruption through additional deployments face practical limitations. Small vessels required for such operations would need to operate within areas subject to persistent monitoring. The likelihood of detection and interception reduces the feasibility of sustained activity. Conventional naval engagement is similarly restricted by the disparity in force concentration. Alternative measures, including actions against regional infrastructure or the activation of aligned groups outside the immediate area, carry broader implications, and introduce additional actors. The potential consequences extend beyond the immediate objective and could alter regional alignments. Economic pressure continues to accumulate as export limitations persist. Revenue derived from oil shipments represents a significant component of national income. The inability to move stored or newly produced oil affects both fiscal stability and internal economic conditions. Storage capacity imposes additional constraints, creating a finite window for maintaining production levels without adjustment. Domestic conditions are influenced by these factors. Reduced revenue and external restrictions contribute to internal economic strain. The duration of the current situation increases the impact over time, affecting both state resources and broader economic activity. The question of resolution depends on several potential pathways. One outcome involves negotiated adjustments to existing conditions. This would require alignment between multiple parties and the establishment of terms addressing both security and economic considerations. Such an outcome depends on the willingness of involved actors to modify their positions. A second possibility involves escalation. Actions taken to alter the balance through expanded operations could lead to broader engagement. This scenario introduces additional risk and uncertainty. as responses from other parties would shape subsequent developments. The scale of involvement could increase beyond the current operational area. A third outcome involves continuation without immediate resolution. In this case, existing conditions persist, and all parties adapt to a prolonged period of restriction and adjustment. Economic effects would continue to develop, and operational patterns would stabilize around the established framework. Each of these pathways operates on different timelines and involves distinct forms of risk. Negotiated outcomes require time and coordination. Escalation produces immediate consequences, but with uncertain long-term effects. Prolonged conditions extend the impact gradually across economic and operational domains. Historical comparisons provide context for understanding such situations. Maritime restrictions and blockades have previously extended beyond the duration of active conflict, with resolution occurring through a combination of negotiation and adjustment. The interaction between military presence and economic necessity has shaped outcomes in similar cases. The current environment reflects a convergence of these elements. Military forces maintain control over key transit routes, while economic systems respond to altered conditions. Diplomatic channels remain active, but have not yet produced a definitive outcome. Each component influences the others, creating a complex system of interaction. From an operational perspective, the enforcement of restrictions continues according to established procedures. Naval assets monitor movement, assess compliance, and respond to deviations. The consistency of these actions reinforces the existing framework and defines the conditions under which transit occurs. Commercial actors respond based on risk assessment and available information. Decisions to proceed or delay shipments are influenced by observed enforcement patterns and the perceived likelihood of disruption. Insurance considerations, cargo value, and contractual obligations all contribute to these decisions. The interaction between enforcement and response determines the pace at which activity resumes or remains limited. Incremental changes in confidence may lead to gradual increases in transit, while incidents or perceived risks could produce renewed hesitation. The process does not follow a fixed schedule but evolves based on accumulated outcomes. The broader implications extend beyond the immediate region. Changes in supply routes, pricing structures, and investment priorities reflect adjustments to the current situation. Over time, these changes may alter the structure of energy markets and the distribution of strategic importance among different transit corridors. In the present phase, no single event defines the transition to resolution. Instead, the situation progresses through a series of incremental developments shaped by operational, economic, and diplomatic factors. The alignment of these elements determines the eventual outcome. Until such alignment occurs, the conditions governing the Strait of Hormuz remain in effect. Movement through the corridor continues under monitoring and enforcement, while affected parties adjust their strategies within those constraints. The timeline for change is not fixed and depends on decisions made across multiple levels of engagement.